The BRATVA'S ruin. Part 1. The debt that bought her. There are debts measured in money. There are debts measured in blood. And then there are debts that can only be settled with a life. Chapter 1. Snow and Silence. The snow fell the way bad news always did in Moscow. Quietly, relentlessly, without mercy. Sofia Volkov stood at her bedroom window on the 4th floor of her father's crumbling estate in Presnensky district, watching the white obliterate the city below. It was past midnight. The street lamps threw amber cones through the storm, blurring at the edges, like flames drowning in cold water. She had been watching the snow for an hour without seeing it. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over the conversation she'd overheard 2 hours ago, pressing at it the way you press on a bruise. Testing how much it hurt, testing how real it was. Very real. Her father's voice, muffled through the heavy oak door of his study. I have nothing left to give him. A silence so deep she'd held her breath. And then the other voice, the one she didn't recognize, low and unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man who had never once been told no. You have Sofia. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass now. Outside, a black SUV idled at the iron gates of the property. It had been there for 40 minutes. The engine never stopped running. She could see the exhaust rising in white curls, ghost-like in the storm. 2 men stood beside it, big men, still as statues, in black coats that the wind didn't seem to touch. They weren't waiting for the snow to stop. They were waiting for her father to finish deciding. Sofia knew what kind of men stood still in the middle of a Moscow snowstorm at midnight and waited without impatience. She'd grown up in the orbit of men like that. Her father had been one of them once, before the gambling, before the loans, before the slow, humiliating unraveling of everything Pyotr Volkov had spent 40 years building. Her father had been a minor player in the Bratva's outer circle, never made, never fully trusted, but useful. A financial conduit. A man who knew how to move money and ask no questions. He had also, apparently, been a man who knew how to lose it. She didn't know the exact amount. She suspected it was catastrophic. There had been too many whispered phone calls over the past 3 months, too many envelopes slid under doors, too many mornings where her father appeared at breakfast looking like a man who'd already died and simply hadn't been informed of the fact. She had asked him twice. Both times he'd kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. Don't worry, Sofia, I'll fix it. The 3rd time she asked, 2 weeks ago, he'd taken her hands in his and said nothing at all. Just looked at her with those dark, ruined eyes, her mother's eyes, the ones she'd inherited, the ones everyone always commented on, and said nothing. That silence had been its own kind of answer. She turned from the window when she heard the footsteps on the stairs. Her father was a broad man, though the weight he'd lost this year had taken something essential from his frame. He moved like a man carrying invisible stones. He stopped in her doorway, backlit by the hallway light, and for a moment he looked exactly as he had in the old photographs, strong, certain, untouchable. Then he stepped into the room and the illusion collapsed. He was 61 and looked 80. His hands, gripping the doorframe, were shaking. Sofia. She had known her father her entire 25 years. She had heard him use her name 1,000 ways, warm, impatient, proud, exhausted. She had never heard it sound like this, like an apology that arrived too late for anyone to survive. She crossed her arms over her chest, not in defiance, in the instinctive self-protection of someone bracing for impact. Tell me, she said. He came into the room, sat on the edge of her bed, the same bed she'd had since childhood, the headboard carved with roses she used to trace with her fingers as a child, pretending they could bloom. He sat there and stared at his hands in his lap and said nothing for so long that the silence became its own conversation. How much? She asked. He looked up. Does it matter? It matters to me. 4 million, he swallowed. American dollars. I borrowed against the estate, against the business accounts, against, he stopped. Against things I had no right to borrow against. I thought I could recover it. I thought, he stopped again. You thought you could gamble your way out of a gambling debt. It wasn't kind. She didn't intend it to be. There was a particular cruelty to watching someone you love destroy themselves, and Sofia had been watching it for 2 years, and the kindness had worn thin somewhere around the time she'd sold her mother's jewelry to keep the lights on. "I was told," her father said carefully, "that the debt has been purchased." Her stillness changed quality, became watchful. "Purchased. Another party has acquired it. The terms have." He paused on every word like each one cost him physically. "The terms have changed." "What party?" The name, when it came, rearranged the temperature of the room. Nikolai Sokolov. She had heard the name. Everyone in Moscow had heard the name, the way everyone knew the name of a storm that had leveled a city. Nikolai Sokolov, Pakhin of the Sokolov Bratva, one of the 3 remaining dominant criminal organizations in the Russian Federation. 41 years old, born in the industrial wastelands of Yekaterinburg. Made his first million before he was 25, his first 100 million before 30, his first enemy's funeral before 35. He did not negotiate, he did not compromise, he did not forgive debts. He collected them. "Why?" Sofia said, and her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Would Nikolai Sokolov buy a $4 million debt from a man like you?" Her father's face did something complicated, something that looked almost shamefully like relief. As if the telling of it was the worst part, and now that it was told, the stone had been lifted even if the pit remained. "He wants to settle the debt in an alternative arrangement." She waited. "He wants you to marry him." The snow kept falling outside. The SUV kept idling at the gates. The men in the black coats kept waiting with their terrible, unnatural patience. And Sofia stood in her childhood bedroom with roses carved into the headboard behind her, and the remnants of a life she'd tried to preserve crumbling in real time beneath her feet, and she felt something close to ice moving through her chest. Not fear, not yet. Something colder than fear. Recognition. "He wants me," she said slowly, "as payment for a gambling debt." "Sofia." "He wants me as property," she said, "as a settlement, as something that can be traded across a table like a—" She stopped herself, breathed once carefully. "Look at me." Her father looked up. "Did you agree to this?" The answer was in his face before his mouth opened. The shape of a man who has already made the deal and is only now performing the conversation that should have come before it. "They are waiting at the gate," he said. "They want an answer tonight." "An answer," she repeated. "You mean my answer or yours?" "Sofia." "Because it sounds as though the answer has already been decided." "If you refuse," he stood abruptly, turned away from her, pressed both hands to the window glass, looking down at the black SUV, the same view she'd had an hour ago. "If you refuse, they will take the estate, everything in it. I will be," he exhaled hard. "It will not be a clean collection, Sofia. These are not men who send lawyers." She understood what he was telling her without saying it. She had grown up around enough violence to understand its grammar. The men standing at those gates were not delivering a request. They were delivering an ultimatum shaped like a request. "You could have told me sooner," she said. "You could have warned me." "I was trying to protect you." "You were trying to protect yourself from having this conversation." She picked up her robe from the chair beside the window and put it on, tying it with sharp, deliberate precision. "You waited until there was no other option. You waited until I had no choice. And now you're standing here letting me believe I'm making a decision when what you actually did is sell me." "Sofia." "Don't," she held up one hand. "Don't say my name like that. I'm not angry at you, Papochka." And she wasn't. The anger had burned itself to something quieter and more permanent. "I'm just telling you the truth." Pyotr Volkov turned from the window. His face was a ruin. Not metaphorically. She could see the architecture of what grief and guilt and shame had done to the bones of him, and for a moment she wanted to go to him the way she had as a child. Press her face against his chest and let him tell her everything would be fine. But she was not a child, and nothing would be fine. "Tell me about him," she said instead. Her father blinked. "Nikolai Sokolov." She kept her voice even, practical. She had always been good in emergencies, better than she had any right to be, perhaps, but survival required a kind of calculus, and she had been running the numbers for years. Tell me what you know. Chapter 2. The Architecture of MONSDRS. What her father told her that night was incomplete. She knew it even as he spoke. There were things a man like Pyotr Volkov would not say to his daughter, not because he wanted to protect her, but because there were things about Nikolai Sokolov that could not be spoken aloud in a house being watched without inviting consequences. The framework was this. Nikolai Sokolov had taken control of the Sokolov Bratva at the age of 32, following the death of his uncle, Dmitry Sokolov, a notoriously brutal packhen who had run the organization for 15 years with a philosophy that favored violence over intelligence. Nikolai had been different. Where Dmitry broke things, Nikolai dissected them. Where Dmitry demanded loyalty through terror, Nikolai demanded it through something more durable. The understanding that to betray him was not merely fatal but comprehensively, architecturally ruinous. He destroyed his enemies from the inside. He was known to wait years to collect on a slight. He was known to know things about people that no one should know. He was known, in certain circles, as Prizrak, the ghost, because his surveillance apparatus was invisible until it wasn't, and by then it was far too late. He had business interests across 12 countries. He was a legitimate art collector, a donor to 3 Moscow universities, a man who appeared at the opera and the ballet and spoke fluent French and German in addition to Russian and English. He had never been arrested. He had never been indicted. He had been investigated twice by the FSB, and both times the investigations had concluded without charges, and with the curious spectacle of the investigators in question relocating to other cities. He had never married. He had, as far as anyone knew, never maintained a serious relationship with any woman. He was spoken of in the circles Sofia's father traveled as a man who kept his private life so private it was effectively invisible, which was itself a kind of power, because it left everyone guessing, everyone vulnerable to the imagination. "Has he ever met me?" Sofia asked. Her father hesitated in a way that made her skin go cold. "Once, you were 17. There was a dinner, you were at the table briefly before you went up to study." She searched her memory. "I don't remember him." Her father stopped. "He what?" "He remembered you." She absorbed this, pressed it flat and stored it somewhere she could examine later. "Is he violent?" "He is." Pyotr chose his words with unusual care. "He is a man who uses violence precisely, not recklessly. He is not cruel for pleasure. He is controlled." As endorsements went, it was the most damning thing she'd ever heard spoken, as if it were a comfort. She looked out the window one more time at the SUV and its ghosts in black coats. "Tell them," she said, "that I'll speak with him myself." Her father went still. "Sofia, if I am to be bartered, I will at least negotiate my own terms." She turned from the window. Her reflection stared back from the glass, dark hair loose around her face, dark eyes level, a calm that was not calm at all, but rather the particular composure of someone who has decided that breaking down is a luxury they cannot afford. "Tell them I want to meet him, not at some table, not surrounded by his men. If he wants this arrangement, he can have the conversation." "That is not how." "Tell them," she said again, and something in her voice apparently communicated sufficient seriousness, because her father closed his mouth. He left the room. She heard him on the stairs, heard the distant groan of the front door, heard the muffled exchange in the cold outside. She used the time to dress. Not because she was going anywhere tonight, it was 2 a.m, but because she needed the ritual of it, the performance of control. She put on black trousers and a white blouse and her mother's pearl earrings, and she brushed her hair until it fell in a dark river to her shoulders. And by the time her father returned to her doorway, she felt like herself again. Or close enough to herself. "He will come tomorrow," her father said. "At 7 p.m, he will come alone." He agreed to that. Her father's expression was unreadable. He said, a pause. He said that was acceptable. Sofia noticed the hesitation. What else did he say? Pyotr Volkov looked at his daughter for a long moment. Looked at her the way, a man looks at something precious that he has already lost. He said he expected nothing less from you. Chapter 3. The hour before the storm. She did not sleep. She sat at the writing desk in her bedroom and went through what she knew about Nikolai Sokolov with the methodical thoroughness that her mother had called her best quality and her father had called her most exhausting one. Sofia had always processed crisis through information. She read, she researched, she organized. What she found, digging through her laptop in the small hours of a Moscow winter morning, was both more and less than she expected. There were no photographs of Nikolai Sokolov from the past 5 years. Older images, from newspaper coverage, from the edges of society page photographs where he appeared at cultural events, showed a man who fit his reputation. Tall, dark-haired, built with the kind of lean, controlled musculature that suggested discipline rather than vanity. His face was all sharp architecture, strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once and set straight again. His eyes in photographs appeared dark, though she would later learn they were gray, the peculiar gray of winter light on the Moscow River, which was the color of something that had never been warm. He smiled in none of the photographs, not in the performative way of a man who refused cameras. It simply seemed as though smiling were a thing that occurred to other people. She found 2 profiles in business publications, arm's-length pieces that discuss the legitimate holdings of the Sokolov Group, a diversified holding company with real estate, import-export, and private equity interests, without once acknowledging the criminal enterprise underneath. She found one investigative piece, published in a German newspaper 6 years ago, that was considerably more specific. She read it twice. The journalist who wrote it had subsequently left the country. By 4 a.m, she had assembled a profile of a man who was brilliant, remorseless, and structurally unreachable. A man who had spent 20 years constructing a life without vulnerabilities, without soft edges, without the kind of human entanglements that could be used against him. And this man had bought her father's debt. And this man had specifically asked for her. She sat with that fact for a long time in the amber light of her desk lamp, while the snow went on falling outside and the rest of the house slept around her. It made no logical sense. Nikolai Sokolov could have any woman he wanted, or rather, and this was the important distinction, he could acquire any woman he wanted. He had the resources to construct any life he chose. He did not need to collect a debt to obtain a wife. Which meant he had chosen this specific method, this specific debt, this specific woman. The why of it was the thing that kept her from sleeping. The why of it was the thing that, even as she lay down at 5 a.m. and closed her eyes and willed herself to rest, moved through her thoughts with the quiet insistence of a current beneath still water. What did Nikolai Sokolov want? And the second, darker question beneath it. What did Nikolai Sokolov already know? Chapter 4, Nikolai. He arrived exactly at 7. Not at 7:02, not at 6:58. At 7 o'clock precisely, as if he had calibrated his arrival against an atomic clock and considered lateness a form of disrespect and earliness a form of vulnerability. Sofia was standing at the window of the sitting room when the car appeared. Not the same black SUV from last night, this was a different vehicle. Longer, lower. The kind of armored car that wore its danger quietly, like expensive clothing. It stopped at the front door and one man got out, not from the back, as she expected, but from the passenger seat. The driver remained. He was taller than she'd expected from photographs. 6'3", perhaps 6'4". He wore a black coat, unbuttoned despite the cold, over a dark suit. No hat, no scarf. The snow hit him and seemed to know better than to accumulate. He looked up at the house with an expression that she was too far away to read, and even at that distance, even through a second-story window in the failing winter light, she felt the quality of his attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something in the atmosphere shifted when he looked at a thing. She stepped back from the window. She was not afraid. She told herself this firmly, standing in her mother's sitting room with her mother's furniture and her mother's pale green wallpaper, and the telling of it felt mostly true. She had made a decision last night, while sitting at her desk in the small hours. She would not enter this situation as a victim. She would not walk into that room with her father's desperation in her posture and her hands shaking and her voice performing compliance. If Nikolai Sokolov wanted her, he would meet her. All of her. Not a woman diminished by fear, but a woman who had assessed the situation and chosen, within the very narrow margins available to her, her own strategy. She heard the front door, heard her father's voice in the hallway, thin with the effort of normalcy, heard another voice, low, unhurried, responding in monosyllables. She was seated when they came in, not posed, not performing, simply seated in the chair by the fireplace with her back straight and her hands in her lap, and her face arranged in the expression she used when she wanted to think clearly and project nothing. Nikolai Sokolov walked into the room and looked at her, and the first thing she understood was that she had been completely wrong about his eyes. They were not dark. They were gray, exactly as the photographs she'd found had suggested, but the photographs had not prepared her for what gray could mean in a human face. It was not the washed-out gray of absence. It was the gray of precision, of a mind that processed everything it saw with the dispassion of an instrument. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has studied thoroughly and is now encountering in 3 dimensions for the first time, and there was something in that look, something layered and complex and not entirely readable, that made the back of her neck prickle with a sensation she couldn't immediately name. Not fear. Something more complicated. He was, she registered almost against her will, extraordinarily compelling to look at. The photographs had conveyed the architecture of his face, but not its effect. The way the sharpness of it combined with the utter stillness of his expression to produce something that felt less like handsomeness and more like danger in a form the body found inexplicably attractive. He had a scar along his left jaw, thin and white, barely visible. His hands, as he removed his coat and draped it over the chair her father gestured to, were large and unhurried. He sat down across from her. Her father hovered near the door in the manner of a man who badly wanted to be somewhere else. "Shall I have Irina bring tea?" "No." Nikolai's voice was exactly as she'd heard it the previous night through the study door. Low, precise, carrying no inflection that could be called warmth. Not cold, precisely. Cold implied effort. This was simply the natural temperature of a man who had stopped needing to perform accessibility. "Leave us." Her father left, the door closed. Sofia did not look away from Nikolai Sokolov. He had not, since entering the room, looked away from her. "You wanted to speak with me," he said. "My father indicated you would prefer I didn't. Your father's preferences are not what interest me at the moment." A pause, precise, deliberate. She absorbed the full weight of what was being said, "You interest me," and filed it away without reaction. "Mr. Sokolov," she began. "Nikolai." "We are not at that stage." Something shifted in his expression, so slight she almost missed it. The most minimal compression of the muscle at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. As if the idea of stages amused him, as if he had already mapped every stage between where they were and where he intended them to arrive. She pressed on. "You purchased my father's debt." "I did." "You could have called it in, taken the estate, the business assets, whatever was recoverable." "Yes." "You chose not to. You chose instead to propose an arrangement involving me." "That is accurate." She studied him. He let her. That was interesting, she noted, his total ease under scrutiny. Most people, studied openly, became restless. He had the stillness of a man who had nothing to hide, not because he lacked secrets, but because he had long ago stopped caring whether they were found. "I want to understand why," she said. "Do you?" "Yes." He regarded her for a moment. The fire crackled behind her. Outside, the snow had lightened, the storm exhaling itself into a gentler fall, just enough to blur the edges of the night. "Because it interested me," he said finally. "Marrying a stranger to settle a debt interests you." "You interest me, Sofia Volkov." No performance in it, no seduction, just the flat, considered weight of a statement he'd apparently decided to make and made. "That is a rare thing." She let a moment pass. "You said that as though I should find it flattering." I said it as though it's true. What you find in it is your own business. There it was, the thing that wrong-footed her slightly. She'd prepared for arrogance, for the particular entitlement of a man used to getting what he wanted. She'd prepared for veiled threats, for the performance of generosity designed to obscure the coercion underneath. She had not quite prepared for this, whatever this was, the bluntness of it, the absence of performance. "What do you want from this marriage?" she asked. Specifically. "A wife." "That tells me nothing." "What would tell you something?" "The truth." He leaned back slightly. Not relaxed. She had the impression this man was never fully relaxed, that even in rest there was a kind of calibrated readiness, but at ease, considering. "I want someone in my house who is not afraid of me," he said. "I want someone at my table who can speak to the people I deal with as an equal. I want—" the slight pause again, precise as everything else about him. "I want the particular quality that you have, Sofia Volkov." "And what quality is that?" His gray eyes were steady on hers. The inability to be managed. The word landed in the room and expanded. She felt it touching everything. "You want a wife who can't be managed," she said carefully. "That seems counterintuitive for a man in your position." "Everything important is counterintuitive." He said it simply, as if it were obvious. "The men in my world surround themselves with women who perform compliance, beautiful furniture with voices. It is tedious and it is strategically useless. What I require is different." Sofia looked at him for a long moment. She was aware, in the part of her that was always running the careful, protective calculus, that this conversation was doing something she hadn't planned for. It was making her curious. Not attracted, she was rigorous about the distinction, even sitting across from a man whose physical presence was difficult to remain entirely neutral about, but genuinely, uncomfortably curious. "You're describing me," she said, "as though you know me." "I know some things about you." "Such as?" A pause that lasted precisely long enough to communicate that there was more behind it than what was about to be said. "You graduated first in your law cohort at Moscow State University. You turned down a position at Prokhorov Partners to work at a legal aid organization in Tversky, where you have spent the last 2 years doing work that pays you approximately 12% of what you would have earned in corporate law." His voice was entirely without emphasis. He was not impressed by this or performing admiration. He was simply listing facts he had assembled. "You speak 3 languages fluently and a 4th passably. You run 6 kilometers every morning regardless of weather. You cook when you're stressed, and you read when you're sad, and you have not cried in front of another person in at least 4 years, as far as I can determine." The room had grown very still. "As far as you can determine," she repeated very quietly. "Yes." "How long have you been determining these things, Mr. Sokolov?" The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. It was not the silence of a man who didn't know. It was the silence of a man deciding exactly how much to reveal. "Long enough," he said. Sofia felt the cool fingers of something move along the back of her neck. Not the same prickling awareness as before. Something older and more urgent. The instinctive alertness of a creature that has just identified a predator it has been unable to see. "You were watching me," she said. "Before this, before the debt." He did not confirm or deny this with words. He simply held her gaze. "For how long?" she asked. He rose from his chair. Smoothly, unhurried, as if the conversation had reached a natural point and he was moving on. He picked up his coat. "The car will come for you on Saturday at 10 in the morning," he said. "You will bring what matters to you and leave the rest. The house staff will be compensated and—" "I asked you a question." He paused, turned to look at her. She was standing now, had come to her feet without consciously deciding to, drawn up by some instinct that said you don't let a man like this leave a room while you're still sitting down. He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight was at her back, and she was aware of how she must appear to him, dark hair, dark eyes, the composed face she'd assembled that morning like armor. She was also aware that whatever he saw, it was not new to him. He looked at her the way a man looks at something deeply familiar. "Saturday at 10, he said, and left. She stood in the sitting room for a full minute after the front door closed, listening to the sound of the car leaving, and tried to decide whether what she was feeling was the fear that had finally caught up with her or something else entirely. She decided, with the careful rigor she applied to most things, that she didn't know. And that not knowing frightened her far more than anything else about that evening. Chapter 5, Saturday. She told herself she was not going to make peace with it. The distinction mattered. There was a version of this story, the one she refused, in which she moved through the week quietly accepting her circumstances, in which she packed her life into suitcases with the resigned grace of a woman who has recognized the inevitable and made her accommodation. She had known women like that. She understood the appeal of it, the way capitulation could feel like dignity if you controlled its timing. She was not going to do that. She spent the week at the legal aid office working her full hours, which she had not mentioned to her father and would not mention to Nikolai Sokolov. She was midway through 3 cases, a domestic situation in Meshchansky that was heading toward criminal territory, a housing dispute that had its own complications, and a young man in Zamoskvorchye who needed representation he couldn't pay for. She could not abandon these people on a Wednesday because a Bratva Pakin had decided to acquire her. She worked. She finished what she could finish. She made arrangements for her colleagues to cover what she couldn't. She did not tell them why. She said she was taking a personal leave. She went home each evening to the estate and ate dinner with her father, who had the appearance of a man slowly being reprieved from an execution he'd expected. He was careful with her, solicitous. He brought her tea she hadn't asked for and hovered near doorways as if afraid she might disappear. On Wednesday night, she asked him, "Did you know he'd been watching me?" Her father set down his teacup, a small, specific hesitation. There were rumors years ago that he had taken an interest. An interest? Sofia. Did you use that? She kept her voice level, careful. When you were making these arrangements, did you use the knowledge that he wanted me specifically to negotiate better terms? Her father looked at his hands. The answer was in the geography of his silence. Yes, he had. He had known or suspected that this was not purely a debt collection. He had leveraged it. She stood up from the table and went to bed. She packed on Thursday and Friday, not mournfully, practically. She took her law books and her mother's photographs and the small carved wooden bear that had been her grandmother's and the playlists she'd built over 5 years for running and for working and for the particular 2 a.m. variety of loneliness that required music rather than silence. She took her winter clothes. She took the kettle she'd bought herself with her first paycheck because her father's kitchen kettle was ancient and inconsistent, and she took the good coffee she'd been buying for 2 years from a small roaster in Kitaygorod who remembered her order. She was not bringing the person who had lived in this house. She was bringing the things that made her herself. It was a meaningful distinction. Saturday morning, she woke at 5:30 and ran her 6 kilometers in the pre-dawn dark, the city still and snow-muffled around her. She ran her usual route, along the embankment, across the bridge, back through the streets of Presnensky, past the bakery that opened at 6 and put the smell of bread into the cold air like a gift. She ran it deliberately. Felt the pavement under her feet and the cold air in her lungs and the particular intimacy with the city that only came with early morning, before it fully became itself. She ran it as herself, before she became whatever she was about to become. At 9:30, she was dressed. Black dress, structured, nothing theatrical, pearl earrings again, her mother's, her constant, her hair up and neat. She stood in the hallway of her father's house with 4 bags and a box and looked at the space around her, the wallpaper peeling slightly at the corner near the ceiling, the oil portrait of her grandfather that had always slightly frightened her as a child. The coat rack where her mother's camel hair coat had hung for 7 years because no one could bear to move it, and she waited. The car arrived at 10 o'clock. Not the armored one from before. Something else, long and black and immaculate, with a driver who got out without being prompted and loaded her bags with the practiced neutrality of a professional who had performed this task many times. An escort car followed, 2 men she didn't look at directly. Her father stood on the front steps. The snow had stopped overnight and left everything crystalline, precise, the kind of clean winter morning that made Moscow beautiful in the way that required distance to appreciate. "Sofia," he said, and his voice broke on it. She kissed his cheek. "Don't gamble," she said. He nodded. He couldn't speak. She got into the car. Chapter 6, The House at the End of the World. The Sokolov estate was 20 minutes outside of Moscow, in the direction of Rubliovka, the direction of old money and new power and walls high enough to make the city invisible. She'd expected something ostentatious in the way that criminal wealth sometimes was. Gold fixtures and marble excess, a statement of dominance that didn't trust subtlety. She'd been wrong. The gates appeared without warning from behind a row of old pines. Black iron, unornamented, fitted with cameras she could see and presumably several more she couldn't. The drive from the gate to the house was almost a kilometer, through a park that had been designed by someone with a naturalist's sensibility. All native trees and unmanicured snow cover, a landscape that looked almost wild except for the fact that it was clearly, deliberately contained. The house itself was large. Not a mansion by the standards of the neighborhood, those tended toward architectural peacocking, but a structure with a different kind of authority. Built in the classical style, white stone with black detailing, 3 stories, symmetrical, with the severe mathematical elegance of pre-revolutionary design. It looked like a place that had decided what it was a long time ago and had not been interested in renegotiating since. She stepped out of the car into the cold. A woman appeared at the front door. Mid-50s, dark hair shot through with silver, the erect posture and watchful eyes of a woman who ran a household the way generals ran campaigns. "Ms. Volkov," she said, "I am Galina. I manage the house. Your rooms are prepared." She paused with the fractional hesitation of someone delivering information they've been instructed to deliver. "Mr. Sokolov is not at home presently. He will return this evening." Sofia absorbed this. He had not been here to receive her. He had sent staff. This could be read several ways, as arrogance, as a deliberate power statement, as simply the life of a man whose business did not organize itself around her arrival. She chose, provisionally, not to attribute motive until she had more information. "Thank you," she said, and followed Galina inside. The interior confirmed what the exterior had suggested. This was a house of extraordinary restraint. The proportions were palatial, but the decoration was severe, almost monastic, dark wood, stone, good old furniture chosen for quality rather than display. The paintings on the walls were real and serious, 19th century Russian, some early Soviet. Nothing decorative. The rooms were heated to exactly the right temperature and smelled of wood smoke, and something else, a resinous, cool note she couldn't immediately identify. Her rooms were on the 2nd floor. A bedroom with a sitting area, a bathroom that contained better plumbing than anything she'd had access to in the past 2 years, and a small study that had been fitted with empty bookshelves, empty, she understood, for her books specifically. The window looked out over the back of the property, a frozen garden, bare trees, and beyond them the dark band of a pine forest that presumably marked the boundary of the estate. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, taking inventory. The window was large. The door locked from the inside. The study had a second door connecting to the hallway. She was mapping the space the way she'd learned to in the first year of working with clients who came to her in emergencies. You always know your exits before you need them. Then she unpacked, methodically. Her books on the shelves, her photographs on the desk, her grandmother's bare on the window ledge. The kettle in the study's small kitchen area. Her running clothes in the wardrobe drawer designated for athletic wear, as if whoever had prepared these rooms knew. Had known. She paused with a folded shirt in her hand. Had they known which drawer to prepare because they had been given a specific list, or because they had been watching long enough to know? She filed that question next to the others, accumulating in the careful ledger she was keeping. At 3 in the afternoon, she asked Galina if she might use the library, and Galina showed her to a room on the ground floor that made her breath catch slightly, wall-to-wall bookshelves, 2 armchairs flanking a fireplace that was already lit, a reading desk near the tall windows. The books were serious and varied. History, philosophy, economics, literature in Russian and in translation. Not the decorative library of a man who wanted to project intellectualism, but the actual accumulated library of a man who read and thought and read some more. She chose a history of the Soviet security apparatus published in 2009 and curled into one of the armchairs and read until the light failed and the fire needed tending. And when she looked up from the page, it was 6 o'clock, and the room had gone amber and close, and she had, for a single suspended hour, almost stopped thinking about where she was and why. She heard the front door at 7:30. Not loudly. He didn't make noise, she would come to understand. His arrivals were marked not by sound, but by the atmospheric shift she'd first felt looking down at him from the window. The house changed quality when he was in it, something in the air pressure. She stayed in the library. She wasn't hiding. She simply had no intention of appearing in the hallway like something waiting. She was on her 3rd chapter when the library door opened. Nikolai stood in the doorway. He'd taken his coat off but still wore the suit, dark charcoal, impeccably cut, and there was something that might have been fatigue in the lines of his face, though it sat on him differently than fatigue sat on other people. Less like depletion, and more like the particular weight of a man who moved through a world that required constant vigilance and had simply been doing it for a very long time. He looked at her in the armchair, at the book in her hands, at the configuration she'd made for herself, the fire and the lamp and the position near the window, and something in his face did a thing she couldn't fully interpret. "You found the library," he said. "Galina showed me." "She didn't expect you to ask." "Did she tell you I asked, or did you know before you walked in?" A pause. "The house has cameras." "I know." She'd identified 4 in this room alone. "I was asking whether you watched the feed before coming in here, or whether Galina reported to you." He crossed to the other armchair, sat down across from her. "Both," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I want to establish some terms." "I expect you do." "I am not a decoration. I will not perform a role for your associates or maintain an appearance for people who know what I am, what this arrangement is. I will, however." She paused, selecting her words with the precision he'd demonstrated at their first meeting. "I will fulfill my function at whatever gatherings or events you require a visible partner. I will maintain the public appearance of this marriage. I will be a professional partner in any context where such partnership serves us both." She kept her eyes on his. "In exchange, I want autonomy. I want to continue my legal work. I want access to my former life where it is possible, and I want the truth." "The truth," he repeated. "About how long you've been watching me, about what you actually want from this, about what happens if the arrangement fails." She held his gaze. "I am not afraid of hard information, Mr. Sokolov. I am afraid of being managed by its absence." He was quiet for a moment. The fire between them crackled and sent a wash of light across the sharp planes of his face. "You will practice your legal work," he said. "I have no interest in keeping you idle. Idle people become unpredictable." The faintest suggestion of dark humor in this, so faint she might have imagined it. "Your movements within certain geographic limits will not be monitored intrusively. You will have a driver, who is security, but you will not be watched in this house unless I have a specific operational reason to do so." "That is not the same as not watching at all." "No, it isn't." He said it without apology. "This is the world I live in. It cannot be made over into something you're more comfortable with. What I can offer is the particular truth that I will tell you when I'm watching and why." She absorbed this. It was not what she'd asked for. It was, she recognized, considerably more than she'd expected him to concede. "The truth," she pressed. "How long?" He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight did things to his face that the cold precision of daylight or the fluorescent harshness of her office would never have done. It introduced something warm and complex into the geometry, something that didn't belong to his usual expression. 4 years, he said. The word landed quietly. She was good at silence. She waited. Your father came to me with a business proposition in 2020, he said. I turned it down, but He stopped. The pause was unusual, a man choosing precision over speed. I noticed you, in the material he sent, in his description of his family circumstances. I had you looked into. Another pause. And then I continued having you looked into. 4 years, she said again, making it real. Yes. You had me surveilled for 4 years. Yes. She breathed once, slowly, looked at the book in her lap, the history of the Soviet security apparatus, which seemed suddenly and grimly appropriate, and looked back at him. And then my father ran up a debt, she said. Yes. Which you purchased. His gray eyes were very steady. Yes. Was the debt, she stopped, began again. Did you have any hand in my father's debt situation? He held her gaze for a moment that stretched a second too long. No, he said. She believed him, she realized. She believed him and was not entirely sure she should. She believed him and simultaneously understood that it didn't fully matter regardless of whether he had engineered the debt or simply recognized an opportunity when it arrived. The outcome was the same. She was here. He had watched her for 4 years, and she had married him in a civil ceremony 2 weeks from this moment, which she did not yet know. What she knew was this. She was sitting across from a man who had made her into the subject of a 4-year study before she'd been given the opportunity to know his name. And something about this was enraging, and something about this was, she would not yet say the word, even to herself, something else entirely. Tomorrow morning, she said, standing, closing her book, I am going to run my 6 kilometers. I expect the driver you've assigned won't try to follow me in the car. He'll run with you, Nikolai said, at a distance. She looked at him. Is he fast? For the first time, something crossed Nikolai Sokolov's face that was unambiguously, completely a smile. Small, contained, gone almost immediately. Fast enough, he said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark in a stranger's house, in her own rooms in a stranger's house, which was a distinction that felt important and also meaningless, and stared at the ceiling and thought about 4 years. About the 25 years of her life that she had believed to be private. About what it meant that the man now lying somewhere down the hall had spent 4 of them watching her. She thought about his voice saying, I noticed you, and the particular flatness of it, not seductive, not self-congratulatory, simply factual, as if noticing were the most natural thing in the world and the 4 years were merely a consequence. She thought about his face in the firelight. She told herself she was not afraid. She was, for the first time in a very long time, not entirely sure what she was. Chapter 7. The Rules of a Dangerous House. She had been in the house 3 days before she found the first thing she wasn't supposed to find. She wasn't looking for it. She was, truthfully, doing nothing more purposeful than exploring the wing of the 2nd floor that she hadn't yet investigated. Not snooping, not strategically gathering intelligence, but simply doing what she always did in unfamiliar spaces, learning their geography, understanding where things were. The door at the end of the east corridor appeared locked. She noted it and moved on. 2 days later, it was open. She saw it as she passed, the latch not quite fully caught, a strip of darkness showing between door and frame. She paused. The sensible thing to do was keep walking. She pushed the door open. The room was unremarkable at first, a study, smaller than the library downstairs, with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window overlooking the eastern perimeter of the property. Standard office furniture, nothing obviously significant. Then she noticed the left-hand wall. It was covered in a large map of Moscow, annotated extensively in a cramped handwriting she would later identify as Nikolai's, locations marked, lines drawn, numbers and dates that meant nothing to her immediately. But pinned to the edges of the map, arranged with precise spacing, were photographs. Surveillance photographs, long lens, taken without the subject's knowledge, buildings mostly, locations, street corners and apartment buildings, and what appeared to be the exterior of an underground parking garage. And in the center of one cluster of photographs, pinned with a single red pin, a photograph she recognized, the exterior of her legal aid office building in Tversky. She stood very still. The date printed at the bottom of the photograph was 8 months ago. She removed it carefully from the wall and looked at it. The photograph was taken from street level, looking across at the building entrance. She could see, in the background, caught by chance or by intent in the frame, a figure coming out of the main door. Dark coat, dark hair up, bag over one shoulder. Sir. She replaced the photograph exactly as she'd found it, stepped out of the room, closed the door until the latch almost caught. She walked back to her rooms at a normal pace, with her hands folded behind her back, and her face controlled, and her thoughts moving at the speed of a river that had just been told there is a waterfall ahead. He had been watching her there, at work, not just monitoring her movements through data, through records and databases and the passive intelligence gathering she'd already half accepted. He had had photographs taken, physical surveillance, at her office. She sat in the study and looked at the wall and thought about the word obsessive and the ways in which it lived on a spectrum from the intense to the alarming. She thought about the photograph in the center of the cluster with the red pin. She thought about the date 8 months ago. She thought about what it meant that a man who could have any woman he wanted had spent 4 years documenting the specific geography of one woman's daily life. Then she thought, and this was the thing that made the calculation genuinely impossible, about the way he had told her. Without apology, without embellishment, without the performance of normalcy around it. 4 years. He had said it the way you say true things, plainly. She pulled out a piece of paper and wrote down everything she knew and everything she suspected, because she thought best when she wrote. She listed the facts in one column and the questions in another, the way she did with her legal cases. The facts column was short. The questions column was considerably longer. At the bottom of the questions column, she wrote 2 things and underlined them both. What does he want that 4 years of watching couldn't tell him? And why did he let me find that room? Because she knew, with the careful intuition that had never failed her in her work, that the door had not been left open by accident. Nikolai Sokolov did not make careless mistakes, not of the physical kind. He had left the door open on purpose. The question was whether it was a test, an offering, or something else entirely. She didn't have the answer yet, but she folded the paper and held it in her hands and understood that this was the game, not a game between enemies, exactly, but something more complex. 2 people in a room together, both of them playing at the highest level they knew how, both of them with information the other didn't fully have. She had spent 4 days in his house, and she was already, God help her, not afraid. She was interested. Chapter 8, Blood Owen White. On the 6th day, she saw what he did. She had been told not to go to the eastern wing of the ground floor after 10 at night. Galina had communicated this instruction with the particular economy of someone delivering a rule that is not explained because the explanation would be worse than the rule. Sofia had accepted it provisionally. She was not suicidal. She was strategic, and spent the first 5 nights respecting it. On the 6th night, she woke at 2 in the morning to voices. Not argument. She'd had 3 years of proximity to violence and knew the difference between the sounds it made and the sounds of ordinary life. This was purposeful, controlled, men speaking with the particular compressed efficiency of a situation being managed. She heard them from her bedroom window, carrying up from the area below the east wing's rear entrance. She went to the window, looked down. 3 men stood in the exterior light below. 2 of them she recognized as security, the large, still type she'd been seeing since Saturday. The 3rd she'd never seen before. He was being held upright by the 2 men on his either side, and he was bleeding from somewhere above his left eye, and even from the 2nd floor she could see that he was trying and failing to keep himself composed. Nikolai stood apart from all of them. He had his coat on over what appeared to be clothes he'd been in all day. He had not, she realized, come home yet tonight. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his posture wholly relaxed, speaking to the bleeding man in a voice too low for her to hear. She watched. She should not have watched. She watched. The bleeding man said something. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the tenor. Desperation. Negotiation. the specific emotional syntax of a man trying to change the terms of a situation he'd already lost. Nikolai listened without expression. When the man finished, Nikolai looked at him for a moment in the way that she now recognized as his particular brand of consideration, not warmth, not cruelty, but the precise assessment of someone calculating. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and said something to the two men holding the bleeding man. They let him go. He stumbled, caught himself, stood, looked at Nikolai. Nikolai said something, one or two words, very quiet, and turned and walked back toward the house. Sofia stepped away from the window before he could look up. She stood in the middle of her dark bedroom and realized that her heart was beating fast. Not from fear, or not only from fear, from something harder to categorize. The sight of him in the exterior light, coat dark, posture utterly controlled, the casual finality of that single nod. The man had been released. Whatever Nikolai had decided in those 2 minutes of conversation in the cold, it had not ended in the way it might have. She didn't know what this meant. She didn't know if it made him better or worse than what she'd imagined. She didn't know what to do with the observation that he had the capacity for mercy as well as whatever else was in his repertoire. She went back to bed, lay in the dark. When she heard his footsteps in the corridor, measured, unhurried, passing her door without pausing, she held very still and listened until they faded. 4 years, she thought. He has been watching me for 4 years. And the thought that followed it, unbidden and unwelcome in the dark. What does he see when he looks at me? Chapter 9, The First Dinner. On the 7th evening, Galina informed her that dinner would be served in the formal dining room at 8 o'clock. Not a question. Not an invitation, exactly. An arrangement. Sofia appeared at 5 minutes past 8, not to make a point, simply because she'd been mid-page and had finished the paragraph. The dining room was a long, serious space. A table that could seat 20 set for 2 at one end, candles, actual silver. Nikolai was already there, standing at the window with a glass of whiskey, and he turned when she entered. He looked at her for a moment that had an unfamiliar quality, not the assessing look she'd come to expect, which processed her the way he processed all information, but something different, something quicker and less controlled. "You're reading Ostrovsky," he said. She looked down, then back up. She'd brought the book, Force of Habit. "I usually read at dinner." At a table alone, perhaps, not here. She considered this, set the book on the credenza near the door. "I'm told we're eating together tonight." "We'll eat together most evenings. It's practical." "Practical," she repeated, sitting as he moved to the table. "Everything with you is practical." "Most things," he sat across from her. "Not all things." She filed that away, too. The cabinet she was building of observations about Nikolai Sokolov was becoming very full. She was going to need a larger filing system. They ate. The food was extraordinary. Galina, or whoever cooked, worked at a level that was genuinely remarkable. And they talked, haltingly at first, and then with a rhythm that surprised her. He asked about her cases, which surprised her more. Not with the polite interest of a man performing curiosity, but with specific questions that suggested he had already gathered information and was now testing it against what she actually said. "The housing case in Meshchansky," she said, watching him. "You know about it." "You've mentioned your work. I asked Galina to gather some context." "Galina doesn't know about my work." "I asked someone else then," unapologetic, wholly at ease with the disclosure. "You had my cases investigated." "I had the context of your work investigated. There's a difference." He paused. "The housing situation, the management company, they're connected to Leonid Brzezin's property group." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Brezin owes me a favor." He said this with the same tone he'd used to say Brezin lives in Moscow, simply descriptive. "If you need the housing case resolved in your client's favor, I can have that managed." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't want that." "I know." "Then why offer?" He looked at her across the table with the firelight between them again and the candles and the snow outside the windows. And something in his expression had the quality she was learning to identify, that thing that was almost warm, almost something, before the control closed back over it. Because I wanted to see what you'd say, he said. She set down her fork. You test me. Constantly. Why? The pause, considered precise. Because I've been watching you for 4 years and I still don't have all the answers. She should have found this infuriating. She did find it infuriating. She also found it. She would not say this out loud, not to him, not now, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. She picked up her fork. What are you still trying to find out? He looked at her for a long, level moment. Whether you're afraid of me, he said, or whether you've simply decided that fear is not useful. She held his gaze. What's the difference? The first, he said, means I made a mistake. The second means I was right. He said nothing else for the rest of the meal. She lay awake that night thinking about what he'd said, and what he'd meant, and which answer he was hopping for. She lay awake thinking about the map room with the red pin in her building, and the bleeding man in the snow, and the 4 years that preceded all of it. She lay awake thinking about the way his face had looked for that single unguarded moment when she'd walked into the dining room. And she realized, in the particular honesty of 3 a.m, that she already knew which answer she was going to give him. She was just not yet ready to admit it. Chapter 10. What happens at the edges of things? On the 9th day, they almost kissed. It was accidental, or as close to accidental as anything could be in a house where everything was precisely controlled. They had both reached for the same volume from the library shelf, the Chekhov plays, which she had been reaching for because she felt like Chekhov, and he had apparently been looking for the same book for a reason he didn't share. Their hands had landed on the spine within half a second of each other. He did not pull back. She did not pull back. They were very close. She could see the specific gray of his eyes at proximity, which was different again from a distance. Not uniform, she realized, but layered, with something darker at the center and something almost silver at the edge, like winter's sky during the exact transition between storm and clear. She was aware of his hand over hers on the spine of the book, of his stillness, which had changed character, no longer the calibrated stillness of control, but something held in a different way, tighter, as if the thing being contained was more demanding than usual. She was aware of her own breathing, which she was not controlling as well as she would have liked. She took the book, stepped back. Thank you, she said. I'll find another copy, he said. She read the Chekhov in her rooms that evening and understood, with the precision she brought to all self-assessment, that something had shifted in the 9 days since she'd arrived. Not dramatically. Gradually, the way the thaw works in Moscow, imperceptible day by day, until you look at the window one morning, and the snow on the sill has retreated an inch. She was still herself. She was still the woman who had walked into this house with her eyes open, and her terms laid out, and her refusal to capitulate intact. She was also, quietly, becoming someone who listened for his footsteps in the corridor. She did not like this. She studied it the way she studied things she didn't like, methodically, without flinching. He had watched her for 4 years. He had made her into the subject of what was, by any reasonable assessment, an obsession. He had used her father's weakness to arrange her life precisely the way he wanted it. He was a man who controlled violence with the casualness of a person managing a tool they had long since stopped finding remarkable. And yet he had given her the library and left the surveillance room open and offered to help with her case, and then accepted without argument that she didn't want his help. And yet he sat across dinner tables and asked questions, real questions, not social niceties, and listened to the answers with an attention she was not accustomed to and had not, she admitted privately, fully anticipated. And yet he had said, I was watching you without performance, without apology, without the contortions of a man trying to make a monstrous thing sound normal. He had simply told her the truth and let her do with it what she would. And yet, in the library, he had not pulled back. She folded the piece of paper she'd been writing on, the one with the 2 columns and the underlined questions, and added a 3rd column. She labeled it, What I Don't Know About Myself. The items in this column were few but significant. She fell asleep with the Chekhov on her chest and the snow coming back outside, And in the morning, she would run her 6 kilometers with Mikkel, the security man, maintaining a respectful 200 meters behind her. And she would go back to her cases. And she would eat dinner with Nikolai at the long table with candles between them. And all of this was becoming, with a speed she found both alarming and quietly thrilling, the shape of something she didn't yet have a word for. Chapter 11. The night everything changed. On the 11th day, she came home from the office to find a black car she didn't recognize parked inside the gates. Mikhail, walking her in from the car, had a quality of alertness that he didn't normally carry, a sharpened attention in his posture that made the back of her neck tighten. "What's happened?" she asked. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with, Ms. Volkov." She noticed that he did not say nothing. Inside the house, 2 men she hadn't seen before stood in the entry hall with the particular stillness of men carrying weapons they weren't currently showing. Galina appeared from the corridor, looking entirely composed in the way that Galina always appeared entirely composed, as if composure were a constitutional trait. "Mr. Sokolov asks that you go directly to your rooms," Galina said. "He will speak with you later." "Who is here?" "Business guests," Galina said, which told her nothing and everything. She went to her rooms. She did not stay there. She was not reckless about it. She went to the east corridor, above the great hall, and stood at the gallery overlook that she'd discovered on day 4, the one with the carved balustrade that was deep enough to screen a person from view if the person was careful, and the lighting below was directed elsewhere. The lighting below was directed toward a group of 4 men seated at the central table. She could see the backs of 2 of them and the faces, partially, of the other 2. Nikolai was at the head of the table, which was positioned so that she could see his profile, the sharp line of jaw, the still face. Across from him sat a man she didn't recognize, older, heavy-set, with the complexion of someone who has spent many years in warm countries and returned to Russia with the look of a man who no longer entirely recognizes it. He was speaking. She was too high, and the ceiling acoustics were working against her. She could hear the cadence of the conversation, but not the words. She watched Nikolai's face. She'd been watching his face for 11 days now, with the attention she'd trained on 11 years of reading witnesses and clients and adversaries. She was learning its vocabulary. She knew the expression of controlled assessment and the expression of mild engagement and the expression that was closest to something he might call warmth, which was not warm exactly, but which contained a different kind of quality than the rest. She did not recognize the expression he wore now. It was new, and it was the first time in 11 days that looking at his face produced in her an unambiguous, uncomplicated response. Fear. Not of him, for him, which was a distinction she had not been prepared to make. Whatever this meeting was, it was dangerous in a way that the surface of it was designed to conceal. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, not the controlled stillness of a man who is in complete command of a situation, but the extreme stillness of a man holding very carefully to the command of something that is pressing against its containment. The older man across from him leaned forward, made a gesture, expansive, bilateral, the universal body language of a man making a threat he is framing as an offer. Nikolai looked at him, without moving for a long moment. Then he looked up, directly at the gallery overlook, directly at her. She didn't breathe. He shouldn't have been able to see her. The balustrade was deep, the light was wrong, she was perfectly still. He shouldn't have been able to see her. He held her gaze, or the place where her gaze was, or the shadow that might have been her in the shadow of the balustrade, for 3 full seconds. Then he looked back at the man across the table and said something, very quiet, that she felt more than heard. The 4 visitors left 12 minutes later. She watched them go from the gallery, tracking the conversation's finale in body language only, a handshake that was performative rather than warm, the careful lack of visible aggression, the management of an ending that was not a resolution. When the entry hall door closed, Nikolai stood in the center of it alone for a moment. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who is very tired and is giving himself exactly the 3 seconds that he allows for such things. Then he looked up at the gallery again. "Come down, Sofia." She descended the stairs. He was standing by the entry hall fireplace, one hand on the mantelpiece, coat still on. He looked at her as she came into the room with an expression she was learning, the one that catalogued. "Who are they?" she asked. "People I'm managing." "They threatened you." "They attempted to." He turned from the fireplace. "How long were you watching?" "Long enough." She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way she held herself when she needed the physical reinforcement of her own conviction. "Are you in danger?" The question seemed to reach him differently than he'd expected. Something moved in his face. "People like me are always in some degree of danger." "That's not an answer." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "There is an ongoing situation that I am managing. It is not something you need to be concerned about." "If it's in this house, it concerns me." He was quiet for a moment. Studying her with the particular attention he gave things he was actively recalibrating. "Vadim Merk," he said finally. "He runs an organization based in Vilnius. We have a territorial disagreement." "How serious?" "Serious enough that I would like you to know that if anything disrupts your routine unexpectedly in the next few weeks," a pause, "you should stay close to Mikkel." She absorbed this, not panicking because panic was operationally useless, running the calculus. "Are they interested in me specifically?" His jaw tightened, a very small movement, almost invisible, but she caught it. "They may become interested in you," he said carefully, "which is why I am telling you." "Because I'm a useful pressure point," she said. "If they want to leverage you." "Yes." The word sat between them simply. She thought about being a pressure point, about being, in the economy of Nikolai Sokolov's life, something that could be targeted to reach him. She had been an object of transaction twice now in as many weeks, first as a debt settlement, now as a potential vulnerability. And the strange, particular thing, the thing she would spend the rest of the night examining, was that what she felt in that moment, standing in the entry hall with the snow beginning again outside and the fire behind her and Nikolai's gray eyes steady on her face, was not the cold helplessness of an object. It was something closer to the opposite. He had told her. He had assessed the danger and specifically decided, to tell her. Not to manage her ignorance for her own protection, not to handle the situation without letting it touch her. He had told her because she'd asked, and before she'd asked had been waiting, she realized, to tell her. "Thank you," she said. He blinked, a thing so slight she would have missed it on another face. "For telling me," she clarified. "You didn't have to." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing in his expression that she was learning to recognize, the thing that was closest to warmth but was not warmth, that was more fundamental than warmth, that was something older and more serious, was very present. "Go to bed," he said. "You have an early run." She went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the way he'd said go to bed, not commanding, precisely, but with a particular care in the delivery that she was only now starting to understand the shape of. And she thought about the way he had looked up at the gallery overlook during a meeting that required all his attention and had known she was there, and had not signaled her presence to the men across the table. He had protected her absence, without being asked, without making it obvious. She stared at the ceiling and thought about 4 years, and about the difference between observation and obsession, and about whether a man who had watched her for 4 years could also be, in some specific and perhaps dangerous way, someone she was beginning to trust. And then, in the small, unguarded moment before sleep, she thought, what if he knows everything about me, and I know almost nothing about him? What if that's exactly what he intended? And what if, the thought so quiet she almost didn't hear it, what if I'm starting not to mind? Chapter 12, The Thing Found in the Dark. She found it on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her arrival. She had been in the house long enough by then to know its rhythms, which doors were always locked and which were only occasionally, which staff moved where and when, the particular quality of silence that the house maintained at different hours of the night. She had been in the library every evening. She had been having dinner with Nikolai every night except 2, when he had been absent on business, and had sent word rather than simply not appearing, which she had noticed and noted. She had been building a life in the margins of a life that wasn't hers, and she had been doing it well enough that some mornings she woke not immediately in the thought of it, not immediately cataloging the situation and her position within it, but simply in the morning, in the good bed with the good light coming through the good curtains. She found it while looking for a book. Not in the surveillance room. That door had been properly closed and latched for 3 weeks. In the library. She was looking for a specific volume of Anna Akhmatova's poetry that she'd seen on the shelf a week ago and then lost track of. And she was working her way along the row methodically when she found the photograph slipped behind a book. Slipped or fallen, she couldn't tell. It was a photograph of her, not a surveillance photograph, not the long lens, candid documentation she'd found on the map room wall. This was different. It had been taken 3 years ago, from the date printed at the bottom, and it was a moment she remembered. A summer evening at her friend Daria's apartment, the last summer before Daria moved to Berlin. They'd had people over, 8 or 10 of them. A normal evening, dinner and wine, and the particular happiness of a night that doesn't know it's becoming a memory. Someone had taken this photograph of her on Daria's balcony. She was leaning on the railing, looking out at the city, laughing at something someone had said. She had no idea who had taken it. It could have been Daria or anyone. She was wearing a yellow dress. Her hair was loose. She looked entirely, completely unguarded in the way she rarely was. She had no memory of this photograph existing. She looked at it for a long time. Then she carried it to the sitting area, sat down, and held it in her lap and thought. He had been there, at Daria's apartment or nearby, or he had had someone there, someone at that ordinary summer party who had taken this photograph and sent it to him. 3 years ago, a year before she'd ever heard his name. Someone in her ordinary life, on an ordinary evening, had been watching her for him. The fear, when it came, was different from anything before. Not the cold assessment fear of a rational person evaluating a dangerous situation. Not the managed fear of a woman who has decided not to show it. This was the deeper, more personal variety. The fear that comes from understanding that the story you thought was about you has been, all along, about someone else's idea of you. She set the photograph, face down, on the cushion beside her, and breathed. She would not panic. She would not go to him in the state she was currently in, because she knew herself well enough to know that the conversation she needed to have with him required the version of herself that was composed and precise, and right now she was neither. She sat for a long time. When she was ready, she turned the photograph over and looked at it again. She looked at the woman in the yellow dress on the balcony, laughing, unaware. She thought about 4 years plus more, because if this photograph was 3 years old and the watching had started with a business meeting 4 years ago, then the watching had escalated, had become something other than professional curiosity, had become this. A summer evening at a friend's apartment preserved in photographic evidence in a man's private library. She thought about everything she knew about Nikolai Sokolov. She thought about the first evening in the sitting room and the things he'd listed about her and the flatness with which he'd said 4 years. She thought about the library and the Chekhov and the almost kiss at the shelves and the quiet go to bed. She thought about the way he'd looked up at the gallery and protected her presence from the dangerous men below. She thought about a man who was, by any objective measure, one of the most dangerous people in Russia, who had spent years assembling a detailed portrait of a woman he'd never spoken to, who had then arranged his life, not her life, his to include her. Permanently. She held the photograph. She thought about the question she hadn't asked him yet. The question she'd been circling for 3 weeks, approaching from different angles, finding it each time too large or too revealing to put into words directly. Why me? Not why marriage, not why this arrangement, but the foundational question underneath all of it, the one that the photograph in the yellow dress made suddenly, urgently unavoidable. Of all the women in the world, of all the years and all the choices available to a man with his resources and his intelligence, why, specifically, irrevocably, obsessively me? She stood up. She carried the photograph to the door and went to find him. Chapter 13. What he said. He was in his study on the ground floor, the one she was permitted in, not the Eastern Corridor one, at his desk with papers spread out and a glass of whiskey and the focused stillness of a man working through something complex. He looked up when she came in. His eyes went to the photograph in her hand. He did not move, did not change expression, did not perform surprise or guilt or the social gymnastics of a man caught in something he'd prefer to explain away. He waited. "I found this," she said. "Yes." "This is from 3 years ago." "Yes." "You were at that party, or you had someone there." "Not at the party." He set down his pen. "A member of the building staff was compensated for occasional reports." She absorbed this. For 3 years. For approximately 2.5 years prior to, he stopped, started again. Prior to the debt situation. Sofia looked at the photograph in her hand, then at him. "Tell me why." The silence was long, but it was not the evasive silence of someone building a cover story. She'd heard enough of those to know the difference. It was the silence of a man who had spent a long time knowing this question would come, and was still not entirely sure he had an answer that made sense from outside of itself. "The first time I saw you," he said, "was 2020. Your father sent a photograph with a business proposal, a family photograph, nothing intended. You were in the background looking out a window. You weren't looking at the camera." He paused. "You were reading." She waited. "I had you investigated for the usual security reasons. The report came back and I read it and I..." Another pause, shorter. "I read it again. I read it a third time. The woman in the report was not what I expected." He met her eyes. "You were not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "The daughter of a man like your father. Someone formed by that environment, careful, self-protective in the usual ways, resigned." He said it without cruelty, simply as inventory. "You were something entirely different. You were someone who had grown up in that world and had deliberately, rigorously refused it. You were working with people your father would have crossed the street to avoid. You were." He stopped. "What?" "You were the most genuinely free person I had ever studied," he said. "In the sense of internal freedom, the sense of living precisely according to your own assessment of what mattered." A pause. "I had no category for it." Sofia was very still. "You kept watching." "I couldn't stop." He said it with the same flatness he brought to everything, not confessional, not dramatic, simply factual in the way that the most significant truths sometimes came. "Every report made me want more information, more context. I know exactly what it is, Sofia. I'm not unaware. I know what this looks like from outside of it." His jaw tightened slightly. "But I have been trying to locate a rational explanation for 4 years, and I have not found one that satisfies me." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are telling me," she said slowly, "that you spent 4 years obsessively surveilling a woman you'd never spoken to, and your explanation is that you found her interesting." "Yes." "That is deeply unsettling." "Yes." "And you simply offer this as a fact." "It is a fact." He looked at her with those winter-gray eyes that were, she understood now, not cold at all but extremely full of something that had been contained so long it had become structural, load-bearing. "You asked for the truth. This is the truth, the unmanaged version of it." She walked into the room. Not to him, not yet, not close, but into the room, which was a choice. She sat in the chair across his desk and set the photograph face up between them. She looked at herself in the yellow dress on the balcony, laughing, unaware. "I don't know what to do with this," she said. "I know. I want to be angry. I would expect nothing less." She looked up. Something crossed her face that she didn't try to contain, the particular expression of a person encountering a reality that is both monstrous and, in some inexplicable way, true. "And I want..." She stopped. "What?" She shook her head. "Not yet, not this." He leaned forward very slightly. The desk between them, the photograph between them, the 4 years and everything assembled from those 4 years between them, and the fire, and the winter outside, and the sound of the house breathing around them. "Sofia," he said. His voice had a different quality, not different from tonight, but different from every night. Something in it without the usual management. "What do you want?" She looked at him for a long time. "I want to know," she said, very quietly, "if you are capable of seeing me as a person and not a subject." He held her gaze. The question was in his face before the answer, something working through all that controlled architecture, something that cost him. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the truest thing he could have said. It was the only thing that could have been enough. She picked up the photograph, held it for a moment, then she stood and walked to the fireplace and dropped it in. She turned back to him. "The next time you want to know something about me," she said, "you can ask." She left. In the corridor, walking back toward the stairs, she pressed one hand flat against the wall and held herself still for a single, unobserved moment. Let the weight of it move through her. Let herself feel the full strange complexity of it, the anger and the fear and the other thing, the thing she was not yet nomming. Then she straightened. Walked upstairs. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. Chapter 14. The CLIFFS of What Comes Next. 3 days later, a car she didn't recognize came through the gates. She was at the window. She was often at the window. It had become a habit, a way of orienting herself in the geography of a life that was not, yet entirely her own. The car stopped, not at the front door but at the side entrance, which was unusual. She watched as a woman got out, tall, blonde, wearing a coat that cost more than Sofia's monthly salary had been 2 months ago. Behind her, 2 men who moved like security. Galina appeared at Sofia's door 7 minutes later. Her face was composed in its usual precise way, but there was something beneath the composure. "A guest has arrived," Galina said. "Mr. Sokolov asks that you remain in your rooms for the duration." Sofia looked at her. "Who is she?" Galina hesitated, which was, in Sofia's experience of Galina, unprecedented. "Her name is Irina Volkova," Galina said. "She is—" Another hesitation. "She was closely associated with Mr. Sokolov in the past." Sofia absorbed this. The word closely sat in the room doing several things at once. "How closely?" she said. Galina's composure was genuinely remarkable. "I am not in a position to say more, Ms. Volkov." "I see." Sofia turned back to the window. "Tell Mr. Sokolov I'll be in the library." "He specifically asked." "I know what he asked." She said it without heat. "Tell him I'll be in the library." Galina left. Sofia stood at the window and watched the side entrance and thought about a woman named Irina Volkova who drove through Nikolai Sokolov's gates without advance notice and was met not at the front door but the side entrance, which was a choice of geography that communicated more than any explanation could. She thought about the fact that he had asked her to stay in her rooms. She thought about what it meant that she wanted, instead, to go downstairs. She went to the library. She opened a book. She did not read it. An hour later, she heard raised voices, not from far away, from the floor below, carrying up through the house with the particular quality of a conversation that has stopped performing normal volume. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out tones. Irina Volkova's voice was low and precise and furious in the way that past intimacy makes fury more targeted. Nikolai's voice was lower, controlled, and contained something she hadn't heard from him before, the specific compression of a man who is being pressed on something that genuinely pressures him. 10 minutes of this, then silence, then the sound of movement of the side door of a car leaving. 15 minutes after that, the library door opened. Nikolai came in. He looked entirely composed, which she now knew meant he was working exceptionally hard to appear so. He looked at her in the chair and at the open book in her lap and at her face. "She's gone," he said. "I wasn't concerned." A pause. "Weren't you?" She looked at him, then looked back at the book. "Should I be?" He crossed the room, sat in the other chair, picked up his glass. She noticed he'd brought whiskey, which he didn't normally do in the library, and held it without drinking. "Irina and I have a history," he said. "I assumed." She was under the impression that my situation had not, he paused, selected, that my circumstances had not changed. She didn't know about me. She knew about the marriage. She didn't know about, another pause, longer. She came to understand the situation more clearly today. Sofia set her book down, looked at him directly. What situation? He looked back at her. Those gray eyes in the lamplight, and the fire between them, and the snow outside, and the stillness that existed between them, now different from the first week, different from yesterday even. A stillness that had become, without her deciding it, something she was accustomed to. She came to understand, he said slowly, as if finding the shape of it in real time, that this is not an arrangement for convenience. The room was very quiet. What is it then? Sofia asked. He held her gaze, put the glass down. The fire was the only movement in the room. You know what it is, he said. She did. She was beginning to. She had been beginning to for days, and the slow approaching understanding of it was both the most complicated and the most clarifying thing she had experienced in a very long time. She was also, in this moment, deeply aware that she was sitting across from a man who had watched her for 4 years, who had orchestrated the circumstances that placed her in this house, who was dangerous in ways she was still mapping, who was also, undeniably and increasingly, the person she most wanted to be in a room with. She was aware that this was supposed to be more alarming than it was. She was aware that she was not entirely alarmed. Nikolai, she said, first time, the name in her mouth for the first time, which they both noticed. I need to tell you something. He waited. He was very good at waiting. I found the second room, she said. The filing room off the east corridor. I found the photographs, not just the map, the second set, the one with. She stopped. His face had gone very still in a new way. The second set, he said. The locked cabinet. She watched his face. The one that. She stopped again, because something was happening in his expression that she had not seen before and was not prepared for. What's in the locked cabinet, Nikolai? The silence stretched. I left the surveillance room door open, he said. Deliberately, I wanted you to find the map. I wanted you to ask me about it. I wanted, he stopped. The locked cabinet in the east filing room is not, I did not leave that open. I have not been in that room in 3 weeks. She stared at him. If that cabinet was opened, he said very quietly, it was not by me. A cold moved through the room that had nothing to do with the weather. Someone is in this house, Sofia said. He was already standing, already moving toward the door with the particular controlled speed of a man whose operational mind had just overridden everything else. He turned back once. His face was different, all of it, all the architecture she'd been studying for weeks, rearranged around something that looked, for one unguarded second, like genuine fear. Not for himself. Stay here, he said. Don't open the door for anyone except me. He left. She heard him on the stairs, heard the sharp, clipped exchanges with his security below. She sat very still in the library armchair with the fire crackling and her heart doing something she couldn't manage, and she thought. Someone has been in the surveillance room. Someone has been in this house. Someone who knew what was in that cabinet, knew what Nikolai had assembled there, was sending a message. She looked at the fire. She thought about Vadim Merk and the meeting she'd watched from the gallery. She thought about territorial disagreements and pressure points. She thought about the Chekhov still open on the side table, and her running shoes by the door, and the small carved bear on the window ledge in her study upstairs. She thought about 4 years. She thought, they know about me. And then, quiet beneath all of it, the thought she didn't choose and couldn't stop. He's afraid for me. Nikolai Sokolov, the most controlled and dangerous man she had ever known, was afraid for her. She held on to that thought in the fire-lit library, while his house moved around her with the sounds of men who had discovered that safety was an illusion they'd been maintaining. And she thought about what it meant that she was sitting still and not running. And she thought about the locked cabinet and the photographs she hadn't yet actually seen. And then she heard the sound from somewhere above her. A single sharp impact, like a door slamming or something else. coming from the direction of her own rooms. She stood. She should have stayed in the library. She knew with the deep animal certainty of a woman who has spent 3 weeks studying the architecture of a dangerous man's world, that she should have stayed in the library. She went upstairs anyway. Her door was open. Not slightly, the way it sometimes drifted. Fully. The light inside the room wrong, too bright, the overhead rather than the lamp she always left on. She stepped into her own room. On her writing desk, where the careful list of facts and questions and the third column of what she didn't know about herself had been sitting for a week, was a single photograph. Not one of Nikolai's, not from the surveillance room. A photograph of her, tonight, through her bedroom window, taken in the last hour. Sitting in the window, looking out at the snow. And written across the back of it, in Russian, in ink so dark it looked like bruising. He can't protect you from what's already inside. Below her, the house was in motion. She could hear it, the controlled urgency, the sounds of men moving through rooms, the sounds of Nikolai looking for whatever breach had let something in. She stood in her room with the photograph in her hand and looked out the window into the dark and thought. Someone had been watching her tonight while she'd been wondering if Nikolai could see her as a person rather than a subject. And the thing she felt, the thing she understood with absolute clarity in that moment, was not panic. It was the cold, sharp, entirely clarifying recognition that whatever she had been building in the margins of a life that wasn't hers had just become, irrevocably, hers to defend. She was still holding the photograph when she heard Nikolai's footsteps on the stairs. She was still holding it when he came through the door, saw her face, and went completely still. "Sofia." "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was level. She was genuinely fine, or something adjacent to fine, something forged from the same stuff as fine under high pressure. She held out the photograph. He took it, read it. His face did something she had never seen it do. Something that, if she had to name it, if she had to put a single word to the controlled, architectural, deeply contained expression of a man who had spent years making himself unreachable, she would have called grief. "Nikolai," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the managed version, not what you think I can handle, everything." He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he sat down in the chair by her window, the chair where she read, the chair she had carved out for herself in this space she was slowly making her own, and he began to speak. And outside, the snow fell on Moscow, and inside the house the security team moved through the rooms, and in the east corridor the cabinet that should not have been opened was being examined for what it had contained and what it had given away. And at the center of all of it, 2 people sat in a room and had the first real conversation they'd ever had. The kind that changes everything. The kind you can't take back. End of part 1. The Debt That Bought Her, concluded. Cliffhanger: someone has breached Nikolai Sokolov's impenetrable fortress. The photograph on Sofia's desk proves it. Whoever left that message, asterisk, he can't protect you from what's already inside, was watching her tonight while she was learning to trust the most dangerous man she has ever known. And the terrifying implication of those 7 words, the enemy is not outside the gates. They are already within. Someone in this house, someone in Nikolai's trusted circle, is feeding information to Vadim Merk. And Sofia Volkov, who came here as a debt payment, has become the target at the center of a war she didn't know she was standing in the middle of. Part 2, The Ghost Behind the Glass, continues the story of Sofia and Nikolai as the betrayal inside the Bratva begins to surface. The battle between resistance and desire reaches its breaking point, and a truth about Sofia's own past emerges that neither of them was prepared for. The BRATVA'S Ruin. A series by author. Part 1 of 10.